James Rodney Hicks is often described as one of the most dangerous criminals in the history of Maine. Unlike many serial killers who strike repeatedly in short bursts, Hicks operated quietly over nearly 2 decades, killing 3 women and successfully hiding their bodies for years. His crimes stretched from the late 1970s to the mid-1990s, and for much of that time, he lived freely among the very communities searching for the women he had murdered. Born in 1951, James Hicks appeared outwardly ordinary. He held jobs, maintained relationships, and blended easily into small-town life. But behind that appearance was a man capable of calculated violence, manipulation, and extreme patience. His victims were women he trusted, a pattern that would define his crimes. The first known victim was Jenny Lynn Sear, Hicks's wife. In 1977, Jenny was just 23 years old when she disappeared from their home in Carmel, Maine. Hicks claimed she had simply left him, but her family never believed that explanation. Jenny had no reason to vanish, leaving behind her life without warning. Despite growing suspicion, investigators faced a major problem. There was no body, no physical evidence, and no witnesses. For years, the case stalled. However, as inconsistencies in Hicks's story mounted, authorities eventually charged him in 1984 with murder, even though Jenny's body had still not been found. This was highly unusual at the time. Maine rarely pursued murder convictions without recovered remains. Despite the lack of a body, Hicks was convicted of 4th-degree murder and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served only 6 years before being released in 1990. Hicks's release would prove to be a tragic mistake. While incarcerated, investigators continued reviewing other unsolved disappearances connected to Hicks. One of them was Geraldine Towers, a 34-year-old woman who vanished in 1982 after leaving a bar in Newport, Maine. She was last seen socializing with Hicks. Once again, there was no body, no crime scene, and no hard evidence, only circumstantial connections tying Hicks to her disappearance. Without proof, authorities were forced to let the case remain cold. After leaving prison, Hicks resumed his life as though nothing had happened. He found work at a motel in Brewer, Maine, where he met Lynn Willett, a 40-year-old woman who became romantically involved with him. In May 1996, Lynn vanished without explanation. Co-workers noticed her sudden absence, and once again, Hicks became the primary person of interest. Just like before, investigators hit the same wall. No body, no witnesses, no physical evidence. Hicks denied involvement, and once again, he walked free. By this point, Hicks had successfully gotten away with 3 murders. In the late 1990s, Hicks left Maine and moved to Texas, where his violent behavior escalated. In 2000, he committed a crime that would finally expose him. Hicks targeted a 67-year-old woman in Levelland, Texas, attempting to rob her at gunpoint. But the crime went far beyond robbery. Hicks forced her to sign over checks and the title to her car, then attempted to make her drink cough syrup, planning to drown her and stage the scene as a suicide. The woman fought back and escaped, and this time, Hicks didn't get away. He was arrested, charged with aggravated robbery, and sentenced to 55 years in prison in Texas. Facing the reality that he would likely die behind bars in Texas, Hicks made a decision that would finally bring closure to decades of unanswered questions. He confessed. In exchange for cooperation, Hicks admitted to murdering Jenny Sear, Geraldine Towers, and Lynn Willett. He agreed to lead investigators to the locations where he had hidden their remains. Over several days in October 2000, Hicks guided law enforcement across rural Maine, pointing out burial sites along back roads, wooded areas, and isolated locations. Some remains were buried beneath dirt roads, others were concealed under heavy concrete blocks. For the families, the discoveries were devastating, but they also brought long-awaited answers. With the remains recovered, Maine prosecutors finally had what they needed. Hicks was charged with the murders of Geraldine Towers and Lynn Willett. In November 2000, he pleaded guilty to both killings. The court sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, to be served in Maine after his Texas sentence. Today, James Rodney Hicks remains incarcerated at Maine State Prison, officially classified as one of the state's most notorious serial killers. His case is often cited by criminologists as an example of how dangerous offenders can evade justice when crimes lack physical evidence, and how patience, persistence, and survivor testimony can eventually bring even the most elusive killers to account. Hicks didn't rely on chaos or impulsive violence. He relied on silence. He exploited trust, hid his crimes carefully, and counted on the absence of bodies to protect him. For nearly 20 years, it worked. And for 3 women, Jenny Sear, Geraldine Towers, and Lynn Willett, justice came far too late. On a quiet Labor Day weekend in 2006, the small town of Newry, Maine became the center of one of the most brutal mass murders in the state's history. Nestled in a rural area near Sunday River Ski Resort, the Black Bear Bed and Breakfast was known as a peaceful getaway for tourists. But inside that building, 4 people were brutally killed, and the crime would expose a calculated, remorseless killer named Christian Charles Nielsen. Christian Nielsen was not a stranger to violence. He had a history of criminal behavior, emotional instability, and disturbing fantasies that hinted at something far darker beneath the surface. What happened at the Black Bear Inn was not a crime of passion or sudden rage. It was a carefully planned massacre. The killings took place over Labor Day weekend when the inn was expected to host guests. Nielsen, who had previously worked in the area and was familiar with the property, arrived armed and prepared. Evidence later showed that he entered the inn with the clear intent to kill everyone inside. Lynn Gaudette was the first victim. Investigators believe she was confronted and shot at close range. Her daughter, Sarah, just a teenager, was also killed, a detail that deeply shocked even veteran law enforcement officers. The 2 guests were murdered as well, leaving no survivors.
What made the crime even chilling was what happened afterward. After killing all 4 victims, Nielsen did not flee immediately. Instead, he attempted to stage the crime scene. He tried to start a fire inside the building, likely hoping to destroy evidence and make the murders appear accidental. When the fire failed to spread as planned, he fled the area. The bodies were discovered later, when smoke was seen coming from the inn. Firefighters responding to what they believed was a routine fire call instead stumbled upon a massacre. The scene was described as one of the most horrific in Maine's criminal history. The investigation moved quickly. Unlike many rural crimes that go cold, this case had strong forensic evidence almost immediately. Ballistics, DNA, and witness information pointed toward Christian Nielsen. He was arrested shortly afterward and taken into custody without incident. As investigators dug deeper into Nielsen's background, a disturbing picture emerged. Nielsen had a long criminal history that included robbery, violence, and weapons offenses. More disturbing were his own writings and statements. Authorities discovered that Nielsen had kept journals filled with violent fantasies, hatred toward women, and references to killing. These writings would later become a central part of the prosecution's case. During police interviews, Nielsen showed little emotion. He did not express genuine remorse. Instead, he spoke in detached, almost clinical terms about the murders. Investigators noted that he appeared more concerned with how the crime would be perceived than with the lives he had taken.
The motive was never fully clear, but prosecutors argued that Nielsen committed the murders out of a desire for control and notoriety. The Black Bear Bed and Breakfast was not randomly chosen. Nielsen knew the location, understood the layout, and believed he could carry out the crime without resistance. The case went to trial in 2008, and the evidence against Nielsen was overwhelming. Prosecutors presented forensic proof, ballistic matches, and excerpts from Nielsen's own writings that demonstrated premeditation and violent intent. The defense attempted to argue mental illness, but experts testified that Nielsen was legally sane and fully aware of his actions. The jury deliberated briefly before reaching a verdict. Christian Charles Nielsen was found guilty on 4 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge described the crime as unspeakably evil and stated that Nielsen should never again be free. For the town of Newry, the murders left a permanent scar. The Black Bear Bed and Breakfast, once a symbol of warmth and hospitality, became a symbol of loss and horror. The deaths of Lynn Gaudette and her daughter Sarah were especially devastating, shattering a family and a community in a single night. The case is now frequently cited in discussions about mass violence in rural America, a reminder that even the quietest places are not immune to extreme acts of brutality. Unlike crimes driven by desperation or impulse, the Nielsen murders were methodical, planned, and fueled by a deeply disturbed mind. Christian Nielsen remains incarcerated, spending the rest of his life behind bars. He will never be eligible for parole. The justice system ensured that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another person. John Joseph Joubert IV is remembered as one of the most disturbing serial killers in American history, not because of the number of victims alone, but because of who they were and how he gained their trust. Known as the Boy Scout Killer, Joubert murdered 3 young boys across 2 states in the early 1980s, hiding in plain sight while presenting himself as disciplined, polite, and trustworthy. Born in 1963, Joubert grew up in a deeply troubled household marked by neglect and instability. From an early age, he exhibited disturbing behaviors, including violent fantasies and obsessive thoughts about domination and control. As he grew older, these thoughts intensified and eventually turned deadly. Joubert's first known murder occurred in Portland, Maine in 1982. That year, 12-year-old James Poole disappeared while walking home. His body was later found in a wooded area. He had been stabbed repeatedly, and investigators quickly realized the killing was not random. The wounds showed rage, planning, and a desire to inflict pain. At the time, police had no suspects, no witnesses, no clear leads, and no physical evidence tying anyone to the crime. What investigators didn't know was that the killer was already watching his next move. Shortly after the murder, Joubert enlisted in the U.S. Air Force and was stationed at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. He blended effortlessly. He was quiet, respectful, and involved in the Boy Scouts, volunteering as a scout leader, a role that placed him directly around children and gave him automatic trust from parents and communities. Behind that trusted image was a predator. In September 1983, 13-year-old Denny Joe Eberly disappeared in Bellevue, Nebraska. Days later, his body was found in a field. Like the Maine victim, Danny had been stabbed repeatedly. The similarities were chilling, but at the time, no connection was made to the Maine killing. Just 1 year later, in August 1984, 12-year-old Christopher Walden vanished after being seen with a man matching Joubert's description. His body was later discovered in a wooded area, stabbed dozens of times. This time, investigators noticed something crucial: the pattern. The wounds were nearly identical in all three murders. Authorities launched a massive investigation, interviewing hundreds of people connected to the Boy Scouts and the Air Force Base. Witnesses reported seeing a man driving a tan or brown car near the abduction site. That detail would become key. In July 1984, police stopped Joubert for a routine traffic issue. His car matched the description. During questioning, Joubert appeared nervous but cooperative. What police found inside the vehicle raised alarms: knives, rope, and materials consistent with what was used in the murders. Forensic evidence sealed his fate. Investigators discovered fibers in Joubert's car that matched fibers found on Christopher Walden's clothing. Bite mark evidence and Joubert's own inconsistent statements further implicated him. Under intense questioning, Joubert eventually confessed to the murders. He admitted that he planned the killings carefully. He stalked his victims, gained their trust, and then attacked them in isolated areas. Joubert later told investigators that killing temporarily relieved his violent urges, but only briefly.
The confession also solved the cold case in Maine. When questioned about the Portland murder, Joubert admitted to killing James Poole in 1982, confirming what investigators had long suspected but could never prove. The Boy Scout killer had begun his spree in Maine. In 1985, John Joubert went on trial in Nebraska for the murders of Danny Eberly and Christopher Walden. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury found him guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to death. Maine authorities later charged him for the murder of James Poole, ensuring that even if his Nebraska sentence was overturned, he would never walk free. Joubert spent more than a decade on death row. During that time, psychologists studied him extensively. He showed no genuine remorse. He described his actions calmly, sometimes clinically, reinforcing the conclusion that his crimes were driven by deep-seated sadistic impulses rather than momentary loss of control. On July 17, 1996, John Joseph Joubert was executed by electrocution at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. He was 33 years old. The case left a lasting impact on both Maine and Nebraska. It exposed how easily predators can exploit positions of trust and how dangerous assumptions about safe environments can be. Joubert didn't look like a killer. He wore uniforms, volunteered with children, and followed rules, all while hiding a compulsion to kill. Today, John Joubert is remembered not just as a serial killer, but as a warning that evil doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides behind badges, uniforms, and smiles, waiting patiently for the moment to strike. 3 boys lost their lives before he was stopped. And for their families, justice came, but only after unimaginable loss. In 2010, the quiet rural town of Amity, Maine, became the site of one of the most disturbing triple homicides in the state's modern history. With fewer than 250 residents and little violent crime, Amity was the last place anyone expected a brutal attack that would leave 3 people dead, including a 10-year-old boy. At the center of the case was a man named Thane Ormsby. What made the crime especially shocking was not just its brutality, but how personal it was. Thane Ormsby was known to the victims. This was not a random act of violence or a crime driven by robbery. It was a deliberate, targeted attack fueled by resentment, obsession, and a breakdown in judgment that escalated into murder.
On the day of the killings in July 2010, Ormsby went to a home in Amity armed with a knife. Inside were 2 adult men and a 10-year-old boy. Over the course of the attack, Ormsby stabbed all 3 victims to death. The wounds were extensive, indicating rage and sustained violence rather than a single impulsive act. When authorities arrived, they were confronted with a horrific scene. There were clear signs of a struggle, and the nature of the injuries immediately suggested an up-close, personal killing. The presence of a child among the victims intensified the gravity of the case and shocked even seasoned investigators. Ormsby was quickly identified as the suspect. He did not flee the state, and within a short time, he was taken into custody. From the outset, the case against him was strong. Physical evidence tied him to the crime scene, and investigators were able to establish his movements before and after the murders. As the investigation unfolded, prosecutors revealed that the killings were rooted in long-standing personal conflict. While some details were withheld to protect surviving family members, it became clear that Ormsby believed he had been wronged and that his anger had been building for years. Instead of resolving the conflict or walking away, he chose violence. The murder of the child became the central focus of the case. Prosecutors argued that Ormsby knowingly and intentionally killed the boy, leaving no room for claims of accident or mistaken identity. The medical examiner's findings supported this. The injuries were consistent with intentional lethal force. During pre-trial proceedings, Ormsby's defense explored the possibility of mental illness. However, multiple psychological evaluations concluded that while Ormsby may have had emotional and behavioral issues, he understood the difference between right and wrong at the time of the attack. He was found competent to try stand and legally responsible for his actions. The trial drew intense attention across Maine. Family members of the victims packed the courtroom, sitting just feet away from the man accused of destroying their lives. Prosecutors laid out a methodical case, presenting forensic evidence, witness testimony, and a clear timeline that showed Ormsby's intent. Jurors heard graphic but necessary details about the stabbings, the number of wounds, the force used, and the absence of any sign that Ormsby attempted to help the victims afterward. Instead, the evidence painted the picture of a man who carried out the attack and then disengaged, leaving devastation behind.
In 2011, Thane Ormsby was convicted on 3 counts of murder. The verdict brought a measure of closure, but no relief from the pain felt by the victims' families, especially given the loss of a child. During sentencing, the judge addressed Ormsby directly, calling the crime extraordinarily violent and emphasizing the permanent harm inflicted on the community. Ormsby was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the town of Amity, the murders shattered the illusion that small, isolated communities are immune to extreme violence. Residents struggled to reconcile how someone they knew could commit such an act, and the case left lasting scars that extended far beyond the immediate families involved. The Ormsby case is often cited in Maine as a reminder that the most dangerous crimes are not always committed by strangers. They can grow quietly out of personal grievances, unchecked anger, and emotional instability, until they explode with irreversible consequences. Today, Thane Ormsby remains incarcerated, serving his life sentence. He will never be released. 3 lives were lost in that Amity home, 2 men and a child whose future was stolen before it had even begun. The case stands as one of Maine's most tragic modern crimes, defined not only by its brutality, but by the senselessness of the violence. On the night of March 5, 1873, a brutal crime shattered the isolation of the Isles of Shoals, a small group of rocky islands off the coast of Maine and New Hampshire. What should have been one of the safest places imaginable, a remote fishing outpost surrounded by freezing Atlantic waters, became the scene of one of New England's most infamous murders. At the center of the crime was a man named Louis Wagner. The murders took place on Smutty Nose Island, a barren, wind-beaten strip of land inhabited by only a handful of people. Among them were Annette Christensen and Karen Christensen, Norwegian immigrant sisters who lived on the island with Annette's husband, John Hontvet. Life on Smutty Nose was harsh but predictable. Crime was virtually unheard of. Isolation was protection. That illusion was destroyed in a single night. Louis Wagner was a fisherman and laborer who had previously worked in the Isles of Shoals. He was known to drink heavily and had a reputation for volatility. On the night of the murders, Wagner rowed out to Smutty Nose Island under cover of darkness, navigating rough waters in freezing conditions, a journey that required determination and intent. This was not an accident. This was not a random visit. Sometime during the night, Wagner entered the Christensen home, armed with an axe. Inside were Annette, Karen, and Karen's visiting friend, Maren Hontvet. What followed was swift and savage. Wagner attacked Annette Christensen first, striking her repeatedly with the axe. She was killed almost instantly. He then turned his attention to Karen Christensen, who was brutally murdered in the same manner. The violence was extreme, suggesting rage and personal intent rather than simple robbery. But one woman survived. Maren Hontvet, awakened by the sounds of the attack, hid beneath a bed as Wagner searched the house. At one point, he nearly discovered her. According to later testimony, she remained perfectly still, listening as Wagner moved through the room, his boots soaked with blood. Believing everyone inside was dead, Wagner finally fled the island. Her survival would prove crucial. When authorities arrived, the crime scene horrified even seasoned investigators. The remote location, the brutality of the killings, and the knowledge that the murderer had escaped by boat made the case deeply unsettling. It was immediately clear that whoever committed the crime knew the island and felt confident navigating it at night. Suspicion quickly fell on Louis Wagner. Wagner had been seen earlier that evening on the mainland, drinking heavily. Witnesses later reported that he had suddenly come into possession of money after the murders, despite having been nearly broke before. Even more damning, when Wagner was arrested, police found bloodstains on his clothing. At the time, forensic science was primitive. There was no DNA testing, no blood typing, or advanced crime scene analysis. The case relied almost entirely on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony, including Maren Hontvet's account. Wagner claimed his innocence. He argued that the blood on his clothes came from seal hunting. He denied ever rowing to Smutty Nose Island that night. His defense suggested that someone else could have committed the murders. But the evidence continued to pile up. Witnesses contradicted Wagner's alibi. The money he carried matched funds known to be in the Christensen home. And most importantly, Maren Hontvet testified that she recognized Wagner's voice and movements during the attack. Though she had never seen his face that night, she was certain of who the killer was. The trial became a national sensation. Newspapers across the United States followed the case closely. The idea that a man could row through icy waters to murder isolated women in their own home captured the public's imagination and fear. The Smutty Nose Island murders became a symbol of how even the most remote places were not beyond the reach of violence. In 1874, Louis Wagner was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. However, the case did not end there. Wagner's execution was delayed for years due to appeals and debates over his guilt. Some believed the evidence was insufficient. Others argued that the case relied too heavily on circumstantial proof. But, despite these doubts, the conviction stood. In 1875, Louis Wagner was executed by hanging. Even after his death, the case continued to spark controversy. Some historians have questioned whether Wagner acted alone or whether another accomplice was involved. Others believe the evidence against him was overwhelming given the standards of the time. What remains undisputed is the impact of the crime. The Smutty Nose Island murders changed the Isles of Shoals forever. The islands never fully recovered their sense of safety. Over time, residents left and the population dwindled. Today, Smutty Nose Island stands largely abandoned, its history preserved more in legend and literature than in living memory. The murders also inspired writers, most famously Celia Thaxter, who lived nearby Appledore Island and later wrote about the tragedy. Through her work, the story of Annette and Karen Christensen reached future generations. Louis Wagner's name is now inseparable from one of New England's darkest chapters. Whether viewed as a calculated killer or a desperate man driven by rage and alcohol, his actions left 2 women dead and a community permanently scarred. In the quiet town of Bowdoin, Maine in 1988, a tragedy occurred that would haunt the state for decades. 12-year-old Sarah Cherry, a bright and curious girl, vanished one evening while walking near her home. What followed was a murder investigation that became one of Maine's most infamous and controversial criminal cases and placed Dennis DeChain at the center of it all. 12-year-old Sarah Cherry had lived a typical life for a child in rural Maine. She was known for her energy, her kindness, and her close relationship with her family. On the day of her disappearance, Sarah had gone out briefly and never returned. Her family quickly realized something was wrong, and local authorities launched a massive search. The investigation led police to Dennis DeChain, a 29-year-old man living in the area. DeChain had a criminal record for theft and burglary, but nothing violent at the time. Investigators claimed that evidence tied him to Sarah's disappearance and the location where her body was eventually found, a remote wooded area several miles from her home. Sarah had been brutally murdered, and the circumstances suggested a deliberate act rather than an accident. At the time, forensic technology was limited, but law enforcement relied on witness accounts, fiber evidence, and a confession they claimed to have obtained. Police reported that fibers from DeChain's clothing matched fibers found near Sarah's body and that his truck was seen near the area around the time of her disappearance. DeChain's trial in 1989 became a media sensation. He maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, claiming he had no involvement in Sarah's murder. Despite this, the prosecution presented a case built on circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and the forensic analysis available at the time. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Since his conviction, Dennis DeChain has consistently maintained that he did not kill Sarah Cherry. He has appealed multiple times, citing issues with evidence handling, trial procedures, and forensic methods. Supporters of his innocence argue that the case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and that other potential suspects were not fully investigated. The case remains controversial in Maine. Over 3 decades later, some residents and legal experts question whether justice was truly served. The murder of Sarah Cherry is often cited in discussions about the challenges of prosecuting violent crimes when physical evidence is limited and when confessions or witness testimonies are disputed. For the Cherry family, the crime was devastating. Sarah's life was cut short in an act of senseless violence, leaving behind grief that has lasted a lifetime.
They have repeatedly expressed the desire for closure while also seeking to honor her memory. Memorials and remembrances are held to commemorate her life, and the case continues to draw attention from true crime enthusiasts, journalists, and legal analysts. The murder of Sarah Cherry also raised questions about rural crime investigations. Law enforcement in small towns often faces challenges, limited resources, sparse witness availability, and the need to rely on circumstantial evidence when forensic tools are not advanced. The Deshane case has since become a reference point for discussions on improvements in evidence collection, DNA analysis, and the appeals process in Maine.
Despite decades in prison, Dennis Deshane remains firm in his claims of innocence. Advocates continue to push for additional testing of forensic evidence using modern technology, including DNA testing, in hopes of definitively proving guilt or exoneration. These efforts illustrate the ongoing tension between historical convictions and the evolution of forensic science. The murder of Sarah Cherry remains a cautionary tale of loss, controversy, and the complexities of the justice system. It is a case that has shaped Maine's criminal history, highlighting the consequences of violent crime in small communities and the challenges in ensuring that justice is both served and seen to be fair. Even today, over 30 years later, the case continues to be discussed in newspapers, podcasts, and legal forums. For the residents of Bowdoin and the broader Maine community, the memory of Sarah Cherry endures, a tragic reminder of a life taken too soon and the enduring search for truth. Dennis Deshane's story, whether of guilt or wrongful conviction, remains one of the state's most enduring and debated criminal cases, a chilling reminder that some crimes and the questions they raise can echo across generations. On October 25, 2023, the small city of Lewiston, Maine, was rocked by tragedy. What began as a quiet evening at two popular local venues, the Just-in-Time Recreation Bowling Alley and Shemenji's Bar and Grill, turned into a scene of horror when a gunman opened fire, leaving multiple people dead and dozens more injured. The perpetrator was Robert Card, a longtime resident of Bowdoin, Maine, and a sergeant first class in the U.S. Army Reserve. The attack marked the deadliest mass shooting in Maine's history. Robert Card had lived in the state for years. By all outward appearances, he was a disciplined and responsible adult. His military service lent him structure, while his local ties kept him connected to the community. But behind that image, something had been building, an anger, isolation, and violent intent that would explode catastrophically on that October night. Card's attack began at Just-in-Time Recreation, a family-friendly bowling alley. According to eyewitnesses, he entered the establishment armed and began shooting indiscriminately, targeting anyone in his path. Panic spread instantly as patrons ducked behind tables, barricaded doors, and fled the building. The scene quickly became chaotic, a stark contrast to the laughter and camaraderie that had filled the alley just moments before. After leaving the bowling alley, Card drove to Shemenji's Bar and Grill, a popular local restaurant. There he continued his assault, opening fire once again. Patrons and staff tried desperately to escape. The combination of two targeted locations within a short time frame amplified the terror, leaving residents across Lewiston stunned. Emergency responders were called to both locations, racing against time to contain the situation and save lives. The aftermath was devastating. Several people were confirmed dead at the scene, while others were rushed to hospitals with life-threatening injuries. First responders described scenes of chaos and carnage, noting the sheer speed and precision with which the gunman carried out his attack. For a small city like Lewiston, the scale of the violence was unprecedented. Authorities quickly identified Robert Card as the suspect. He was a veteran familiar with firearms, and his knowledge of weaponry and tactics likely contributed to the scale of the tragedy.
Police issued alerts, warning residents to shelter in place as law enforcement mobilized to locate him. Card fled after the attacks, triggering a multi-agency manhunt involving local police, the Maine State Police, and federal law enforcement. Investigators began piecing together the timeline of Card's movements, examining his background, social connections, and digital footprint. They sought to understand what motivated him to commit such a violent act. Reports indicate that he had been struggling with personal issues in the months prior, including mental health challenges and possible social isolation, but the exact triggers remain under investigation. What is clear is that he planned and executed the attacks with lethal intent. During the investigation, authorities revealed that Card had used a vehicle to travel between the two attack sites, demonstrating both premeditation and coordination. Evidence from surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, and ballistic analysis confirmed that the shootings at both locations were carried out by the same individual. The methodical nature of the attacks amplified the shock and horror in the community. Law enforcement continues to study the case as they work to understand the factors that led to the attack. Card's military training, personal circumstances, and mental health are all under review in an effort to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Experts have noted that understanding the signs of escalating behavior, isolation, and access to weapons is critical in addressing potential threats before they erupt. The Lewiston mass shooting is now the deadliest in Maine's history, a grim reminder that violence can strike anywhere, at any time. Robert Card, the man behind the attack, has become a symbol of the dangers posed when anger, isolation, and access to lethal tools converge. His actions have irrevocably changed the lives of dozens of families, the city of Lewiston, and the broader state of Maine. In the aftermath, communities across Maine have sought to honor the victims and rebuild. Vigils, memorials, and community gatherings have allowed residents to mourn collectively while also focusing on prevention and awareness. For many, the hope is that by remembering the victims and understanding the tragedy, future acts of violence might be prevented. This case serves as both a cautionary tale and a call to action, a stark reminder that vigilance, awareness, and mental health support are vital in protecting communities from those who might commit acts of extreme violence.